Going through the different men in the Bible here in our men's Bible study. Ladies have actually been looking at the ladies in the Bible too. Learning what we can about them. Usually we learn from their successes. A few of them we've learned from different failures they've had. And the man I have tonight is Elisha. So let's fill in. Who was Elisha? Well, to talk about Elisha, you about got to talk about Elijah. Elisha was mentored by Elijah, and then Elisha eventually succeeded Elijah in a role that, for lack of better, we'll call the head prophet at the time. So we have these two men. They were living during the time of the divided kingdoms. Israel had gotten the promised land. They had their first three kings, Saul, David, Solomon, and the kingdom had split. And in their lifetime, they were living with two split kingdoms, a kingdom in the north. That was actually the rebel tribes. 10 broke off, but they still called themselves Israel. And there were two tribes that stayed with one of the kings that was the son of David. And they still had Jerusalem, they still had the capital, and they still had the temple down there. And we found out the northern kingdoms never had a good king. As God goes through and has all the kings listed in the Bible there's always this little summary verse. It's either this king did right in God's eyes or he did wrong. And all those kings in the north did wrong, some worse than others. That's the time they're living. Pretty much a rebellious time, a lot of idolatry, the big idol being Baal that everybody liked to worship up there in the northern kingdom. Southern kingdom wasn't much better, but they did have some good kings that turned things around for a while, every once in a while. They were also miracle-working prophets. They didn't always just come up with, this is what God says. They would do different things beyond the laws of nature. And we'll actually look at a couple of Elisha's miracles today. Depending on whose list you use, of miracles recorded in the Bible, Elijah has 9 miracles and Elisha has 14. But people cut that up different ways depending on how they count a miracle as 1 or 2 sometimes, so there's some difference in there. And people also say that Elijah was kind of like a type of John the Baptist, which helps explain why John the Baptist was called coming in Elijah's power. And Elisha was more like a type of Christ. Elijah was more the in-your-face type kind of guy. He got the job of taking on good old King Ahab there and the prophets of Baal. Elisha comes in and he seems to be more willing to work with people and talk with them than Elijah had the privilege of doing. All right? And our subtitle is Ready to Serve. So we're going to look at how Elijah was ready to serve for God when the opportunities arose. And the first two are going to be quite obvious here. We're going to look at his calling, and then we're going to turn around and look at when he assumed the office. So hopefully you have Bibles handy. If not, you're kind of in the wrong place. I'd recommend you go grab it quick. And we're going to start out in 1 Kings chapter 19. So if you're there with me, I won't read every verse. Try and fill you in as to what's going on here. This chapter comes after Elijah's great victory on top of Mount Carmel. He took on all the prophets of Baal. They couldn't get their God to light the fire. He built an altar, soaked it with water, prayed one simple little prayer. The thing got burned up all at once like that. He called for the people to obey the laws at the time and kill the false prophets. And they did that up there, and he thought, aha, we got this Baal worship thing licked. But really not much changed. In fact, when he got threatened by the queen there, good old Queen Jezebel, he was running for his life. And God finally led him back to Mount Horeb. And there he had another meeting with God. That's the one, if you remember, where God sends a strong wind. And he didn't speak to Elijah in that. He sends a earthquake. Didn't speak to Elijah in that. Sends a great roaring fire. Still doesn't speak to Elijah. And then he has that still small voice. And that's where our story here is going to pick up, that we're going to look at. In that still small voice, God told him a few things. One of them was that he still had the 7,000 people there in Israel that had not worshiped Baal. God still had a remnant. God was still doing what he was going to do. Elijah's fear or assumption that he was the only one left just wasn't true. And then he gave him 3 assignments. And I want to look at that. So if you're in 1 Kings 19 with me, we're going to read verses 15 and 16. All right, 1 Kings 19, verses 15 and 16. And the Lord said unto him, Go, return on the way into the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Assyria, anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel-Melech, shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. So we had a 3-point task there, 3 people he was going to anoint to be different jobs, 2 of them kings and 1 of them his replacement. One of the commentators I read said that once these 3 people had finished their job, the Baal worship was pretty much taken care of. It'd be interesting to verify that myself. So that was where the order came from. God actually chose Elisha to be this prophet. And let's look at how Elijah calls Elisha. We're going to start reading that in verse 19 now. And I want to read 19 through 21, then we'll circle back and talk about these 3 verses, all right? So if you're with me, 1 Kings 19:19. So he departed hence and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah, and said, Let me pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, Go back again, for what have I done to thee? And he returned back from him, and took the 12 yoke of oxen, and slew them, and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen, and gave unto the people, and they did eat. And then he arose and went after Elijah, and ministered unto him. So let's go back and take this apart here and see what's going on. First of all, plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. Now, I really don't know much about farming. I certainly don't know much about farming from 8th century BC. But I'm seeing this as 12 yoke of oxen, probably a total of 24 oxen, 2 to a yoke. I could be wrong, maybe it's 4, with 1 plow each. I'm sure they didn't have multi-bottom plows at the time. So you got 12 teams of 2 oxen, each with a plow. Somewhere he has enough servants to run the other 11 plows. And at that time, oxen were pretty expensive. They were very valuable in the work they did there. They could pull longer, stronger, and harder than a horse or a donkey. So they were quite often. So the point of this part of the passage is that this was one impressive rig. You can think of it as being a modern farmer who just got his brand new, I don't know, what do you guys use? 24-row combine, okay. Air conditioning, automatic steering, yeah, okay. This was quite an impressive setup he had here. The family must have been pretty well off. We know here his father was still alive, so more than likely the farm was actually technically his father's. But he's out there plowing. And then we see one type of character trait here is it mentions that he's running the last plow. So if we're understanding how these teams of oxen worked, he is on the 12th plow. There's 11 ahead of him. And I kind of imagine the first one does the first furrow, the second one goes after that one, does the second, and they go across here. So the poor guy running the 12th team is the one that's getting all the dust. It's like he's chosen to take the worst possible position of the day, when more than likely he's in charge of this whole group plowing that day and could have chosen any position he wanted to with his servants there. But he chose that position for himself, and that's where Elisha finds him. plowing with his last yoke of oxen. This is a different anointing too. Also, when we think of anointing, especially the kings, it was usually oil they poured on the head. Some sort of a ceremony of some type. We read about it with King David, when Samuel anointed him to be king. But this is a little different because Elijah's anointing somebody to take his position. So it's more like he just walks by, takes off his coat, puts it around Elisha. But whatever he did, it was effective enough. Elisha fully understood what that meant. It meant that he was supposed to follow Elijah and eventually take his place. And then we see what he did next. He asked to go back, say goodbye to his mother and father. And when he does that, he takes this impressive rig of 24 or so oxen, kills them all, takes their yokes and their plows, uses them for firewood, and cooks him up himself a good going-by feast. Farewell feast here. For him, his servants, I imagine his family came. 24 oxen really could feed quite a few people, I would guess. So what's the point of that? He turns in his 24 oxen and goes off and follows Elijah. What we're seeing the point here is he's not planning to go back. Yeah, he was a farmer. He probably really loved it. He was planning to take over his part of the farm someday, but he's got something better to do now. We don't see any hesitation here, but he just made the choice, I'm not going back, and to do that, he knew he had to get rid of his oxen. So he had a goodbye party with his oxen and his plows there. As most of you know, when I first moved to Elkhart here, I wasn't part of this church. I was here for about 3 years before going to another church that had a handful of pastors on their pastoral staff. The number 2 pastor was preaching one day and mentioned that he got the call to be a pastor a little later in life. Before that, he had been a chemist. And I found that kind of interesting. This was back when I just kind of started my career stuff. And wondered about him just packing up what he had done before and taking the call to ministry there. Made me wonder, if God called me to do that, am I willing to pack up my soldering irons and my oscilloscope and my board designing software, leave it all behind and do what God wanted it to do? To make the point even more, if we think about some of the other guys we have here in the church, I'll mention first names only, and what they do, it's kind of hard to imagine. If you can imagine Ryan giving up his pipettes and his analyzer he uses on his chemicals, that would be about the same thing here. If you can imagine Paul just shutting down his accounting software, never to open it up again because he's got a calling from God. Or how about Brent selling off his combines and his hail balers and his hay delivery trailers because God's called him to do something. No plans to come back. Or even could you imagine Alan turning in his badge and his keys to his police car? This is the kind of decision he made there. When he got the call, he didn't rethink it, didn't hesitate. He knew that's what God wanted him to do, and he followed after Elijah. And during this time, he was being trained by Elijah. We don't know how long that training lasted exactly. I got some people guessing about 6 years. I found another person tried to put together a timeline based on the different kings and how long they ruled and when they started and how those stories intersected with the other things we have mentioned by Elisha. They had like 23 years, and they had Elisha doing most of his miracles during that time. That doesn't quite fit the narrative to me, but maybe that's right. But he was with him for quite a number of years before we go on to our second story here, and that is when he assumes the office. This is a fairly common story. We won't read all the verses again, but it is in 2 Kings chapter 2. So if you want to turn over there, 2 Kings chapter 2. And it starts about when he got the job. Verse 1, it talks about somehow he knew. We assume Elijah knew too that this was going to be Elijah's last day on earth. We don't know. Maybe there had been a prophecy years before that gave a date. Maybe they woke up and just felt it, but somehow they knew this is Elijah's last day. Now you think Elijah would just want to sit at home that day, thinking his work was done, but no, he wanted to go on a trip. So the first place he went to was Bethel. He traveled to the city of Bethel, and there was one of these places that was called the home of the sons of the prophets. And this was an interesting group, because it appears that even though there was a lot of idolatry going on here in the country, a lot of people not following God, there were still some that wanted to serve God, wanted to teach what needed to be taught to the people, serve the people, and guys that wanted to do that, at least some of them, could come to one of these things called the schools of the sons of the prophets. From what we're putting together by how it's mentioned in the Bible, it was some sort of like communal living. It wasn't really a monastery, because we know that at least one of the guys had a wife and some sons, so they were still living as family units too. And here they were being trained in the ministry and serving in the ministry with this group. But when Elijah and Elisha showed up there, those guys knew that today was going to be Elijah's last day. And they talked to Elisha about it, and Elisha just told them, hold your peace. Yeah, we know that. We don't want to ruin it. This is Elijah's last day. And Elijah visited with those prophets for a while, and then he decided he was going to go on to Jericho. The city had been rebuilt since the days of Joshua, and there was another school of the prophets there. Originally, Elijah told Elisha, just wait here for me. But Elisha knew better, and he's going to follow Elijah wherever he went. So they go to Jericho, short little hike away. Another one of those schools of the prophets was there. So, and those prophets knew it too. Today's going to be Elijah's last day. Elisha tells him, yeah, I know, just be quiet about it. After that, whatever Elijah did there, he decided to go on to the other side of the Jordan River. As he leaves the city, which is practically within sight of the Jordan River, I understand, 50 of these sons of the prophets kind of follow along with him. And let's read verse 8. All right? Kings chapter 2, verse 8. And Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and hither, so that the two went over on dry ground. So here we have one of Elijah's miracles. Hits the water with his cape. It splits apart. A lot like we've seen with Moses, a lot like we saw Joshua coming across about the same place during the initial invasion. Splits apart, they walk across. And the 50 sons of the prophets saw that. After they get across the river, Elijah asked Elisha a particular question. Let's read that. And this is verse 9 now. So 2 Kings 2:9. And it came to pass when they were over, Elijah said to Elisha, ask, what shall I do for thee before I am taken away from thee? And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. That sounds a little strange to us maybe, but this was a typical firstborn right. The customs of that day was, when a man died, they divided the property up, well, more or less when he retires. He divides his property up among his sons. And the oldest son's going to get twice as much as the rest. If the man has 3 sons, the oldest son gets half, the other 2 get a quarter. If he has 5, the first son gets 2/6, and the others get 1/6. It came with a catch. The oldest son was then responsible to take care of the father in his old age, their mother in the old age. So the son was kind of like a 401k policy for the parents. But Elisha had already known God was calling him to replace Elijah. So he kind of wanted that same blessing a firstborn son would get. And that's what he was asking for there. A double portion. Some people have taken and counted the miracles that Elijah did and Elisha did, and they come up with Elisha doing twice as many miracles as Elijah. Maybe that's it, but I think there's more to it, like being the rights of the firstborn son there. So Elijah comes back with a condition. We'll read about that in verse 10. And he said, "Thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken away from thee, it shall be unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so." So the basic qualification was, if you're with me when I'm taken away, you'll get your wish. You'll get what you wanted there. He didn't have to wait too long. Probably within hours, as they were walking along and talking there, we have the famous ascension of Elijah. Elijah is one of the two people in the Bible that did not die like other people. They went up to heaven directly. It was him and Enoch. We can read about how that happened here in verse 11. So again, 2 Kings 2, verse 11. "And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven." That marked the end of Elijah's career, as for what we're calling today head prophet. And then Elisha was left there. He mourns. He does the traditional mourning of ripping his clothes open, like they did then, in grief. We don't know how long he cries, but he picks up, well, we'll read about it. Verse 13. "And he took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and when he went back, stood by the brink of the Jordan." We'll go on to 14:2. "And he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and smote the waters, and said, Where is the Lord God of Elijah? And when he had also smitten the waters, they parted hither and hither, and Elisha went over." So he pretty much repeats the same miracle Elijah did. Now the 50 sons of the prophet that followed him down to the river before are still there, and they see this. They immediately assume, yes, God's power that was with Elijah is now with Elisha. Elisha's our new leader as head prophet. It took them a while kind of maybe to grip on to how that all meant, because they wanted to go out and look for Elijah. Elisha already known, he's gone. God's taken him. He's not coming back. But if we look in verse 16 and 17, 50 of those men spent the next 3 days scouring over that part of the country, looking for Elijah. They couldn't find anything. They came back, and Elisha said, "Yeah, I told you shouldn't go. It wasn't going to work." So we see that the sons of the prophet recognized him as being the prophet in Elijah's place. We even see the men of Jericho, that city there, recognize him as the prophet. If we look through verses 18 through 20, in 19, they said, "The men of the city said unto Elisha, Behold, I pray thee, the situation in the city is pleasant, as my Lord seeth, but the water is not, and the ground barren." So they had a well there that didn't have good water, and Elisha does a miracle of throwing some ground flour in there and heals the well. So they're seeing him as the king there. What points do we want to learn from this part of Elisha's life? Well, first of all, he waited for it was time to take the position. Every once in a while, you'll see a man that kind of butts into where he's not supposed to be at that time. I personally known of about 4 men, not associated with our church, but from around the area here, that at one time fancied themselves as being some sort of a preacher or a pastor. Managed to get an ordination from somewhere. And those 4 men have actually gotten into a place where they're divorced now. Probably took on the position of that office too early in their life, for whatever reason, or there could have been sure several other spiritual problems along the way. But he waited for it was time. He didn't usurp his authority over Elijah. He waited until the time it was for him to take over. But when that time came, he took the position, he just stepped into it and started working. No thinking about it, no going back and forth. If we think of other guys in the Bible who God's given a job to, we have Moses tried to turn down his job. The first time he was too anxious, he killed somebody, but the second time there at the burning bush, he practically tried to just turn it down. God wouldn't let him. Gideon, which we've seen here in one of our recent lessons, put out his fleece just to make sure he was called. I mean, he had full thing there. God told him exactly what he was supposed to do, but he still put out his fleece. And we already saw with Elijah, after Mount Carmel, just kind of wanted to quit. Jonah ran away when he was called. And even Jeremiah didn't think he could do the job when God called him to do that. We don't see any of that here with Elisha. He went out to do what he was supposed to do, what God had called him to do. So those are the 2 first things we see in Elisha's life. When he was called and when he took the office. And we're seeing him there being a servant ready to go. Do what God wanted to do. There's a lot of material in the Bible on Elisha. But I thought we'd look at 2 of his miracles next and see how he served there. And the first one is actually kind of helping the nation of Israel. And we're going to look at that here in Kings chapter 3, 2 Kings chapter 3. Let me try and fill you in on the details of this one. King Ahab, the guy who won the award from God of being the worst king ever in the nation of Israel, had one time defeated the country of Moab, but instead of taking them over and driving them out, he made them pay tribute. The Moabites were great farmers and shepherds. So their annual tribute that the country of Moab was supposed to pay to King Ahab of Israel was 1,000 lambs and 1,000 rams with their wool coats still on. Well, when Ahab died, his son Jeroboam became the new king of Israel. And the king of Moab, King Misha, decided he was going to stop paying that tribute. He saw the new king there as being kind of weak, thought he could get away with it. Of course, Jeroboam didn't like it, so he came up with a plan. I have this drawn up over here. So, the king of Israel's up there in Samaria. He sends messengers down here to the king of Judah, who was Jehoshaphat at the time. And his plan was to march his army from Samaria and Israel, pick up the army of Judah. And Judah had had some run-ins with Moab, had defeated them in a battle before. He thought, this would be a great guy to have on my side. But instead of attacking Moab from the north, hopefully you can make out my high-class map here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, all right? But instead of attacking Moab from the north, where there was a lot of fortifications, they decided they sneak in here from the bottom and attack from the south. And somehow or another, a deal was made with Edom to join them in the battle. So we got a battle here of 3 kings fighting against Moab. See what can be taken out of there. The problem was, once these 3 armies got here, they ran out of water. Interesting to see how the different kings handled it. If you look at chapter 3, verse 10, we'll see what the king of Israel did. And the king of Israel said, "Alas, the Lord hath called us these three kings together to deliver us unto the hand of Moab." It says, we're out of water, we can't fight, we can't win. Why is God doing this to us? What's kind of interesting is here, King Baal was supposedly supposed to be the god of the weather. And, here's this Israel king that worships Baal, forgets that his false god's supposed to take care of this, and he blames the real God. Interesting, isn't it? Jehoshaphat, the king from Judah there, in verse 11 says, do we have a prophet anywhere? Is there anybody that can speak for God that we can ask what we want to do? And interesting enough, somehow, Elisha had decided to come follow along with this campaign here. He was actually in the company that was staying there. Some of Jehoshaphat's servants knew that he was there, so they bring in Elisha. Now let's look at verse 14. When they bring him in front of these three kings, Elisha has to make one thing clear. And he does that here in verse 14. And Elisha says, "As the Lord of hosts liveth, before whom I stand, surely, were it not that I regarded the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look toward thee nor see thee." So he's saying, King of Israel, you're not the reason I'm here. You're not one of David's descendants. God's not working with you anymore. You're following another God. I am not here to help you. I am helping here because of the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat. He is one of the true kings. It's one of the descendants of David. He's trying to follow God here. I am helping him. And he makes that point clear. He then asked for a musician to come in, help clear his mind. And then while he's listening to the music, he gets the command from God of what's going to happen. Let's read that. Again, Kings chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. And he said, "Thus saith the Lord, make the valley full of ditches. For thus saith the Lord, ye shall not see wind, neither shall ye see rain, yet the valley may be filled with water, that ye may be drunk, that you may drink, both ye and your cattle and your beasts." So it basically tells them, start digging ditches and fill up with water and we can collect the water. Because God's going to send the water. And sure enough, the next day, that's what happened. But there's even more. In verse 18. "And thus, this is but a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will deliver the Moabites also into your hand." So this is a double deal here. They both get their water, but then God's going to help them win the victory in this battle. So yeah, somehow the next day the ditches fill up with water. We don't have it recorded in the Bible exactly how this happened, whether God had it rain on the other side of the mountains and it filled up the valley, or he just supernaturally created water. But the valley fills up all these ditches and trenches they had dug, filled up with water. They had water to drink. They had water for their beasts that carried all their equipment. They had water for the cattle they brought along for food. Gathers them. They all get their drink there. But even more importantly, the Moabites looked down at their camp there, and for whatever reason, to them, the water looks like blood that's in these ditches and these trenches. And they think, man, this looks like a major slaughter. These three armies have gone out and killed each other. They're supposed to be together, but they've kind of turned on each other. And I guess there was some event in their near history where that had happened. So they thought, let's go into the camp, see what we can get. So they come riding into camp and discover, no, everybody's fine and healthy. They even had a good drink and a good meal, and they're ready to fight. And they just kind of get ambushed as they walk in there. They chase them back out of there. They get the victory. What do we want to learn from this miracle? Well, right there we saw that while Elisha was ministering, he wanted to make sure he didn't confuse the message of God, didn't confuse what God was doing, by stating which king he was working for and why God was helping them. Our next miracle is we're going to see Elisha help an individual. Now there's several of his miracles we could do this with. There was one of these sons of the prophets that died, and his widow was short on money and in debt. The debtor was ready to take away her 2 young sons as payment for the debt. And she came to Elisha, and that's the story where Elisha told her to collect the pots, pour from her little tiny jar, and fill up all the big pots and sell the oil. A miracle there. We could look at the Shulamite woman who at one point set up a special room for Elisha to stay at when he traveled through there. He ended up letting her have a son because her husband was old, but yet she was a younger woman. She would be left as a widow someday if she didn't have a son to take care of her. And then later that son has something like a brain aneurysm or something and dies, and Elisha comes back and raises him. We could talk about the healing of Naaman the leper, but that might not be so much an individual thing. He kind of did that also as a thing to keep the country from getting in trouble with the Syrians at that time. We're going to look instead at one of the sons of the prophets, and we're going to go to chapter 6. So 2 Kings there, chapter 6. Sorry, I got a 30 to 40 minute lesson and only a 20-minute voice. So, in verse 1, we have a sons of the prophets at one of these cities. It doesn't really say which one. And whatever building they had there to learn in or live in or however they did their school and their communal living there was too small. They needed to add on. So they had a plan. Every one of the sons of the prophets living there, they're going to travel over to where the trees grew in Lebanon. Each one was going to cut down a tree, bring it back, and then they were going to have their building program add on to their building. They asked Elisha if that was okay, and he said, yeah, that's great, go do it. They asked him to come along, and he said, yeah, sure, I'll come along with you. So while they were working there, we run into a problem. And we're going to read about that in verse 5. So if you're still with me, 2 Kings chapter 6, looking at verse 5. But as one was falling a beam, the axe head, fell into the water, and he cried and said, alas, master, for it was borrowed. So here we have a difficult situation. Here is the son of the prophet trying to minister, help out the school by cutting down one of the beams. He didn't own an axe himself. To us, this doesn't seem that bad, but iron tools were expensive and a little hard to come by. We've had mankind working with metal ever since like the 3rd generation after Adam, but iron was still hard to get. It took a lot of labor to make it and to make the iron axe heads. And then these axe heads weren't attached to the axe handles as well as ours are today. Matter of fact, back when Moses was giving the laws to the children of Israel, and there was one special thing where they set up the cities of refuge for anybody that accidentally kills somebody. The example given there of somebody accidentally killing somebody is your axe head flying off your handle and hitting somebody. So this is probably a fairly common occurrence, but this poor guy just didn't fly over his shoulder. It actually flew over and landed in the river. The river's dark, muddy, nobody knows where it really is, too deep to wait around and try and find it. And the guy's in bad shape. See, they had a law there in Israel that Moses gave them in Exodus 22:14. I'll read that to you here. And if a man borrow aught of his neighbor and be hurt or die, as this also covered livestock, the owner thereof being not with it, he shall surely make it good. So the rule is if you're borrowing something and it happens to it, it's your job to replace it. So here we have this struggling Bible school student. I imagine he's just like our Bible school students today, short on money. He had to borrow the axe as it was, and it might be months worth of salary and pay of however he was making his money to replace this axe head. So Elisha saw it there. Elisha proposes this absolutely ridiculous solution. He tells the guy to take him where it was. Let's look at verse 6. And he said, and the man of God said, "Where fell it?" And he showed him the place, and he cut down a stick and cast it in hither, and the iron did swim. Now, hopefully you realize, generally metal does not float, especially a solid hunk of it. But that's what happened here. Elisha has God reverse the laws of nature. Now iron's floating on the water. The guy could just reach in, take it, put it back on his handle, hopefully secure it better this time, and get back to work. So in this miracle here, we see Elisha help a guy get back into the ministry. Every once in a while, one of us will have some problem. Ministry becomes difficult. Maybe we make a mistake. Maybe the pressures of life just get in the way. And we need help getting back into the ministry. That's what Elisha did here. So what have we seen here in today's lesson? We've seen Elisha immediately decide to follow God when he was called. No hemming around, no bickering, no going back and forth, no trying to turn it down. We saw him wait until the office became available. Even though he was slated to be there, he wasn't trying to usurp his authority, do things that weren't his to do yet, make decisions that weren't his to make. Following along there until this time came, and when the time came for his office and it opened up, it became obvious it was God was having him take over that position, that he just stepped right into it, started doing things. Fortunately, in his case, everybody accepted him as being the next head prophet they could turn to. We see him use his ministry not to confuse it by stating which king he's trying to help in one circumstance, not trying to confuse God's word or God's purpose. And then we saw him help another man get back to the ministry. In this case, it was chopping wood. So there's the things we can learn, at least some of them. I mean, we could have gone for days and days here on Elisha. I wanted to leave you with one verse from the New Testament as we close here. And if you look in 1 Corinthians 15:58, when Paul's writing this letter here to the Corinthians, he has this section where he talks about how wonderful it is we've defeated death. We don't have to worry about death anymore. Death won't be our final call. It won't be our defeat. It's going to be our victory. And when he gets done going through that, he comes to this verse here, which says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." So he calls them there to do that. You guys are here to serve. Just like Elisha was ready to serve where he could and where God wanted him to. One of the things I like about our church here, a lot of men doing a lot of different things for service. A lot of churches, it's almost the women doing all the work. The men show up Sunday morning, and you can hardly get some of them to do anything. Hopefully you're not one of them, and hopefully you're someone that wants to serve God in the position that he gives you, and you're looking to see what that is. Let's close in prayer, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to look here at Elisha and his life and how he served you. I hope it's encouragement for us to want to find out how you want us to serve you and to put the effort and the desire into that. In thy name, amen.